Troy Donahue's life is a story of contradictions, a star who burned bright and fast, only to be consumed by the very industry that made him famous. His tale weaves through the dreamlike landscape of Hollywood, where beauty, fame, and youth are fleeting currencies that promise immortality but often deliver nothing but emptiness. Donahue's career and personal life were filled with sharp rises and painful falls, making his journey not just a Hollywood story, but a cautionary tale of the price of fame, the fragility of identity, and the bitterness of missed potential. Troy Donahue was born Merle Johnson Jr. on January 27, 1936, in New York City, the son of an upper-middle-class family. His early life was not marked by the poverty or hardship that often shapes the stories of those who later find fame in Hollywood. Yet, it was in the glamour of the entertainment world that he would eventually find both his salvation and his downfall. A handsome young man with classic movie star looks, blonde hair, blue eyes, a chiseled jaw, Donahue was discovered by a talent scout in the late 1950s, when he was still just a college student. He was soon signed by Warner Brothers, where he was rechristened as Troy Donahue, a name designed to evoke a sense of cinematic allure. Donahue's breakout came in 1959 with the film A Summer Place, a romantic drama that became one of the highest-grossing films of that year. Playing a young man involved in an illicit romance with his summer love, played by Sandra Dee, Donahue captured the hearts of teen audiences, earning the label of a heartthrob and the status of a full-fledged movie star. His soft, romantic image made him a symbol of the idealized American youth, and he was soon a fixture in teen romance films. At the peak of his fame, he became one of the most sought-after actors in Hollywood, with films like Parrish, 1961, and Susan Slade, 1961, cementing his place as one of the brightest young stars of the era. In many ways, Troy Donahue was the epitome of the 1960s Hollywood dream, a handsome, seemingly perfect figure whose smile could melt hearts. His posters hung on the walls of bedrooms across America, and his face was plastered on every teen magazine cover. He was the dream guy that young women fantasized about, the embodiment of innocence and romance. But this very image was also the seed of his eventual downfall. Donahue was typecast in romantic roles, often as the charming but emotionally shallow young man. He was never given the chance to explore more complex or challenging parts, and as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, his once unstoppable career began to stagnate. The roles dried up, the teen idol status faded, and the world moved on to a new generation of stars. Donahue's fall from the top was marked by a series of personal and professional missteps. The pressure of being Hollywood's perfect boy next door took its toll on him. By the late 1960s, Donahue began to wrestle with a sense of dissatisfaction and personal despair. His image had become a burden, and the roles he was offered reflected little of his true potential. The industry was changing, with new stars like Warren Beatty, Robert Redford, and Jack Nicholson emerging, actors who brought more complexity and depth to their roles. But Donahue was still stuck in the mold of the teenage heartthrob, struggling to break free. By the early 1970s, Donahue's career was in freefall. His attempts to reinvent himself fell flat. He took on TV shows, but even these failed to revive his status as a leading man. He made guest appearances on popular television shows like The Love Boat and Charlie's Angels, but his roles were often small and forgettable. His name, once synonymous with young love and Hollywood glamour, had become a punchline, a symbol of an era that was quickly vanishing into the past. Behind the scenes, Donahue's life was also unraveling. His marriages were a series of failed relationships, often marked by emotional turmoil. He was married 4 times in his life, and none of his unions lasted. He struggled with alcohol and drugs, his personal demons gradually eroding the foundation of his career. Donahue, the golden boy, was now a man whose name no longer carried the same magic. In the eyes of Hollywood, he was a has-been, a victim of his own early success. As Donahue's fame continued, the pressures of being a constant public figure began to take their toll. In the 1960s and 1970s, Troy Donahue struggled with alcoholism, which would go on to be a central part of his personal story. He openly admitted in interviews that his addiction began as a way to cope with the stress and loneliness of his career, as well as with the disillusionment that followed his initial rise to stardom. His personal life, rife with a series of failed marriages and turbulent relationships, also contributed to his sense of despair. He married 4 times, but none of his marriages seemed to provide the lasting stability he sought. Donahue's battles with substance abuse became increasingly public as his career faltered. During this period, his once promising career began to slip, and his personal life became more chaotic. His struggles with alcohol not only impacted his relationships but also affected his acting career. Donahue became known more for his personal troubles than for his acting talent, and his once stellar career began to decline. The 1960s and 1970s were a difficult period for Troy Donahue. As Hollywood underwent a transformation from the golden age of cinema to the more experimental and rebellious New Hollywood era, Donahue found himself increasingly marginalized. The demand for the type of roles he had become famous for, romantic leads in teen dramas, waned, and he was unable to adapt to the changing tastes of the public or the film industry. By the late 1970s, Donahue was struggling to find substantial acting work. His earlier films were often replayed on television, but he was relegated to bit parts and minor roles in B-movies. At times, his substance abuse made him unreliable on set, and his career became a shadow of what it once was. By the time the 1980s arrived, Troy Donahue was largely out of the spotlight. He was known more for his tabloid appearances and troubled personal life than for his past achievements. Despite the public chaos of his earlier years, Donahue did make several attempts at a comeback. In the 1980s, he began to appear in smaller roles in television shows and movies, including guest spots on popular series like The Love Boat and Fantasy Island. These appearances were often nostalgic nods to his past, but they did provide him with some semblance of work in the fading years of his career. It was also during this period that Donahue began to get sober, undergoing a series of treatments for his addiction. He spoke publicly about his struggles with alcoholism, and in some ways, his journey to recovery became a redemption arc for a man who had once seemed to have it all, only to lose it through his own personal demons. Troy Donahue's marital life is a reflection of both his public image as a Hollywood heartthrob and the tumultuous nature of his personal struggles. Behind the polished exterior of the 1960s teen idol, Donahue's relationships were often marked by instability, emotional turmoil, and heartbreak. His 4 marriages, each distinct and significant in its own way, highlight the complexities of love and the pressures of fame, illustrating how even those who seemed to have it all couldn't always find lasting happiness. Troy Donahue's first marriage came at the height of his fame, when he was still basking in the glow of his status as a teen idol in the late 1950s. In 1959, at the age of 23, Donahue married his first wife, actress and model Susie Parker, who was already an established beauty in the fashion world. The union seemed like a perfect pairing. Both were stunningly attractive, both had their foot firmly planted in the world of Hollywood, and both were in their early 20s, seeking to build their lives and careers. However, their marriage, much like the other aspects of Donahue's life, was filled with contradictions. On one hand, they were part of the glamorous world of movie stars, attending premieres and living a lifestyle most people could only dream of. On the other hand, the pressures of fame and the incompatibility of their personalities eventually took a toll. Donahue, the quintessential boy next door with a romantic, idealistic view of life and love, found that his relationship with Parker was becoming strained. She, on the other hand, was an independent and strong-willed woman who had a very different approach to her career and personal life. Their marriage was short-lived. After just a few years, the couple separated in 1962, officially divorcing by 1963. The dissolution of their marriage, while seemingly amicable at the time, left Donahue with a deep sense of personal loss. He would later describe his first marriage as something that came at a time when he was still trying to figure out who he was, both as a man and as a star. The experience marked the beginning of a pattern in Donahue's personal life, relationships that were intense and brief, often broken by the pressures of his fame, his emotional vulnerabilities, and his emerging struggles with addiction. Troy Donahue's marriage to actress Valerie Allen was one of the more intriguing chapters of his personal life, a brief but significant relationship that took place at a time when Donahue's career and personal struggles were both in flux. This marriage, unlike his other high-profile unions, is often less discussed but nonetheless marked an important moment in Donahue's journey through the ups and downs of love, fame, and emotional turmoil. Troy Donahue met Valerie Allen in the early 1970s, when both were still active in the entertainment industry, though by then Donahue's career was in decline. Valerie Allen, whose real name was Valerie Taylor, was an actress with a smaller, more niche presence in Hollywood. She appeared in a number of films and TV shows, but her career didn't rise to the same heights as Donahue's during his teen idol days. Allen had a striking appearance, blonde, with an ethereal beauty, and was often cast in supporting roles. Unlike Donahue's previous marriages, which had been to high-profile actresses, Allen was not a major star in her own right, and this gave their relationship a different dynamic. For Donahue, who was used to being the center of attention, Allen's less prominent celebrity allowed for a somewhat more private and relatively less scrutinized connection. It's likely that this appealed to him, as he was growing increasingly weary of the Hollywood spotlight and the pressures that came with being a former teen idol. Troy Donahue and Valerie Allen were married in 1979, but their union was brief. Despite the outward appearance of a conventional Hollywood marriage, the relationship was, like many of Donahue's other marriages, turbulent and fraught with difficulties. One of the factors that contributed to the instability of their marriage was Donahue's ongoing battle with alcoholism. By the time he married Allen, he had already faced several personal and professional setbacks. His career had plateaued after his peak in the 1960s, and he had struggled with both the psychological and emotional tolls of addiction. Though Allen was reportedly supportive of her husband during his darker times, Donahue's deep-rooted personal issues made it difficult for the couple to find lasting happiness. Allen, who was also dealing with her own issues related to her career and the pressures of marriage to a man whose fame had begun to fade, found the relationship increasingly challenging. While Donahue had initially hoped that this marriage would provide him with some stability and emotional grounding, it ultimately became yet another casualty of his personal demons. The couple's marriage was short-lived, and they divorced in 1981, after only 2 years. While Donahue had hoped for a fresh start, the marriage to Valerie Allen, like the others before it, ended in disappointment and heartache. Alma Sharp was a relative newcomer to the Hollywood scene, and unlike some of Donahue's previous wives, she did not have an established career in the public eye. Their marriage was an attempt at stability after years of personal and professional turmoil for Donahue, who had battled addiction and seen his career fall from its peak in the 1960s. The relationship seemed more private compared to his earlier, more publicized unions, but it too was troubled. Donahue, now in his 50s, was still grappling with the emotional scars of his past relationships, his struggles with alcoholism, and a fading career. His marriage to Sharp lasted until his death in 2001, though it is often noted that their relationship was not without difficulties. Alma Sharp, who was younger than Donahue, had a more low-key presence in Hollywood and reportedly stood by him during his later years, though their marriage wasn't without its challenges. Donahue's declining health in the years leading up to his death, including complications from heart issues, seemed to further strain their relationship. Troy Donahue died in 2001, and his marriage to Alma Sharp ended with his passing. It remains one of the less discussed chapters of Donahue's personal life, but it was nonetheless significant as his final attempt at love and companionship before his death. Vicki Taylor, an actress and model, was known for her beauty and striking looks, which seemed to complement Donahue's own glamorous image at the time. This marriage, like many of Donahue's relationships, was marked by the pressures of Hollywood fame and personal struggles. Donahue and Taylor's marriage lasted for about 3 years, and it was reportedly troubled. While Taylor was supportive of Donahue, his battles with alcoholism and his emotional issues, stemming from both his career and personal life, put a strain on their relationship. Donahue, who was still reeling from the fallout of his previous marriage to Susie Parker, struggled to maintain stability in his personal life, and this was reflected in his marriage to Taylor. The couple divorced in 1968, and Donahue's personal life continued to be characterized by a series of failed relationships. While the marriage to Vicki Taylor was one of the shorter ones in Donahue's life, it remained significant in that it was another attempt by the actor to find stability amidst the pressures and personal demons he faced during his time in the spotlight. After the divorce, Donahue's career continued its downward trajectory, and he struggled with issues related to substance abuse, further complicating his personal relationships. Vicki Taylor, like his other ex-wives, eventually moved on from the marriage, while Donahue continued to battle the emotional fallout of his failed unions. Troy Donahue, the golden-haired heartthrob who captured the hearts of millions in the 1960s, lived a life that was both glamorous and tragic. After decades of fame, personal turmoil, and a struggle with addiction, Donahue passed away on September 2, 2001, at the age of 65. His death marked the end of an era for a man who had once been the quintessential teen idol, representing the idealized image of youthful romance in the golden age of Hollywood. Yet, his legacy is not just about his films or his fame, but about the human journey behind the glittering public persona. Troy Donahue died of a heart attack in Santa Monica, California, a few months after being hospitalized for health complications. His later years had been marked by a decline in both his health and his professional life. By the time of his death, Donahue was largely out of the public spotlight, living a quieter life compared to the whirlwind of his youth as a Hollywood sensation. His passing was somewhat overshadowed by the tragic events of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which occurred just a day later, but those who remember him reflected on a complex man whose life was both fascinating and filled with regret. Troy Donahue's death in 2001 was not the end of his story, but rather the closing of a chapter that had been filled with both triumphs and tragedies. Though he was no longer the shining star of his youth, he remained an icon of a bygone era in Hollywood. His legacy lives on in the films he starred in, particularly A Summer Place, which remains a cult classic and a nostalgic look at the romantic idealism of the 1950s and 1960s. For those who remember him, Troy Donahue is not just a forgotten teen idol, he is a reminder of the fleeting nature of fame and the human costs that often accompany the pursuit of it. His career was both a reflection of the best and worst aspects of Hollywood stardom, the meteoric rise, the overwhelming pressure, the fall from grace, and the quest for redemption. Ultimately, Troy Donahue's legacy is one of complexity, a man who, despite all his fame, had to fight through his own personal battles and never quite found the lasting happiness he sought. Donahue is remembered today as a tragic figure, a man who, for a brief moment, was the very symbol of youthful romance, but whose life, like so many in Hollywood, was shaped by darker and more complicated realities. His films continue to be watched by new generations, and his story serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of fame, addiction, and the struggle for identity in the ever-changing landscape of Hollywood.